All right, so let's get started here, guys. Mr. Donnelly here. We're going to take a look at Chapter 1. Chapter 1 deals with the kind of orientation unit, so it's a little bit of introductory stuff as well as terminology, and then we'll talk a little bit about some basic biomechanism feedbacks and how the body kind of takes care of itself going forward. So first little bit here is just kind of taking a look at the basic two terms, anatomy versus physiology. Anatomy is your basic structure and shape of different things in the body. So this could be structures of bones, muscles, ligaments, tendons. These are a lot of your large structures. Physiology, on the other hand, then talks about how those structures specifically work. You can see the diagram there talks a little bit about the interaction between parts of the muscle fiber to get it to contract. We'll also then talk a little bit about how neurons fire impulses down the central nervous system. But each unit's kind of split up into a section that talks about basic anatomy, and then we'll talk a little bit about some of the physiology of how those systems work. We're going to talk about two basic types of anatomy. So there's gross anatomy and microscopic anatomy. Gross anatomy talks mostly about large structures, things you don't need a microscope to see, bones, muscles, organs, very large things that are easily identified. Microscopic anatomy are things that we're going to need to pull microscopes out and take a look at, or at least look at slides, prepared slides that are from microscopes. So that would be like looking at the microvilli of the digestive system, or looking at specific tissues during a tissue unit. Those would be more of our microscopic anatomy. Special terminology we're going to use is used that way so that we don't have a misunderstanding of what we're talking about. The same terminology is used across the medical field. So there's specific terms for position, direction, regions, as well as structures. I liken it to when I teach scientific naming in biology. So we want to use a specific term or specific name for things so that we don't use a common name for it, and that common name is different depending on where we're talking about it. So we want to try to use specific terms. The first ones that we're going to start taking a little bit of a look at is orientation terms. So this is how the body is oriented. If we're looking at one structure versus another structure, how would we talk about that structure in terms of its orientation? So a couple of these terms we'll take a look at here are things like medial, lateral, intermediate, and proximal on this page. Most of these terms have an opposite to them. So you can see the first two terms, if you take a look at their definition, they mean the exact opposite of each other. So medial is something that is towards the midline of the body. Lateral is something towards the outsides or outer edges of the body. We could also use these terms when talking about extremities. If you look at the skeleton at the bottom, he is standing in anatomical position. Every term that we're going to talk about is directed from that anatomical position. So you can see he's standing, palms facing forward, feet facing forward, but the palms are facing forward so that the thumb is pointed outward and the pinkies are pointed inward almost. So when you look at your upper extremity, your arm, the thumb side of your upper extremity is your lateral surface, and the pinky side of the upper extremity is the medial surface. You would think it would be opposite, but it's not. In the feet, it is opposite. So your big toe, that side of your foot is medial. Your little toe is then the lateral surface of your foot. We also have another term that kind of stands alone by itself called intermediate. When we talk about structures that are in between other structures, we refer to them as being intermediate. So the example is your armpits are intermediate between the breastbone and shoulder. You could also talk about like your heart. Your heart is intermediate in between your two lungs. Your nose is intermediate to your eyes, or even intermediate to your ears. Those would be terms that we would use intermediate for. Another term that we use in concert with another one is proximal, and then you can see down here is distal. All right, so proximal is anything that is closest to the attachment to the trunk. So proximal we usually use those two terms to talk about extremities. So the proximal is the closest attachment point of the extremity. The distal is the furthest from the attachment point. So the elbow, as you can see here in the example, is proximal to the wrist. Shoulder would be proximal to the elbow. All right. Distal would be then anything further out. So your fingertips would be the most distal portion of your upper extremity, whereas your shoulder, again, would be your most proximal portion of that upper extremity. We also have a few other terms, superior and inferior. Superior, which can also be used in terms of things like cranial or cephalad or cephalic. All right, these are things that are towards the head or the upper portion of the structure. All right, so the example there, your forehead is superior to your nose, your liver would be superior to your stomach, your diaphragm would be superior to your liver because it is closer to the top portion of our body. Inferior then means away from those structures. So inferior would be anything towards the bottom half of the structure, or as the other term in brackets there called caudal. Caudal means tail. So this is anything towards the tail end of an organism. All right. So our feet are the most inferior structure on our body. Head would be most superior. The other two terms and the last ones that we'll talk a little bit about in terms of directions are anterior versus posterior. All right. Anterior, which is also known as ventral, is the front side of the body. Posterior, which is also dorsal, means towards the back side of the body. All right. I always try to use the terms if you think about like a fish or a shark. All right. So they have a dorsal fin. That dorsal fin is on their back. Anterior would be the belly of those organisms. Two other terms that we use, meaning kind of in towards the surface of the body or deep in the body, are superficial and deep. All right, so superficial means something that is closest to the surface of the body. So we have blood vessels, superficial blood vessels that are really close to the surface of our skin. When people exercise or they are hot, their skin usually turns red. That's because those blood vessels are dilated and we've got more blood flowing through them. Deep would then be anything internal in the body. So your intestines would be deep. A lot of your internal organs would be deep. We could also use those two terms when we talk about dissection cuts. So a superficial cut would maybe just cut through the surface of the skin. A deep cut might be cutting through the skin, underlying fascia, as well as muscles then to get into, say, like a bone, blood vessel, or even a nerve. Those terms also change when we start talking about organisms that are four-legged. So at the end of our year, hopefully, if we get back to school, we will be dissecting cats. All right, so a cat is a four-legged animal. They have some different terms that help us orient them as well. So caudal, a caudal still means towards the head. All right, so a four-legged animal, the caudal surface is towards the head. That would also be the anterior surface of the cat. All right. Cephalid or rostral or cephalic is towards the tail of the caudal, means towards the tail, towards the back end of the specimen. This also means posterior in this case for the cat. Cephalad or rostral means towards the head of the four-legged specimen. The rostral or cephalid end of the cat would also be the anterior. Because the cat is four-legged, that changes the orientation of superior versus inferior. Superior would be towards the spine of the cat. Inferior would be towards the feet of the cat. Dorsal and ventral don't really change much here because we're still looking at the dorsal surface being along the spine, the inferior surface being along the belly. All right, we're going to go ahead and stop at that portion here, guys. I would take a look at your... you're going to take a look at the slideshow presentation that we've given you guys that you got to go through and kind of answer some questions. Just make sure you fill those out as best you can. If you got some issues, please make sure you touch bases. We're going to have a quiz over some of these terms starting next week, but we'll give you a little bit better date once we get a little closer to it.